you're going to believe me or your lying eyes, you know? And at some point where there's a denial of just basic reality here that like, this is a corrupting pursuit. If I sound like some moralistic preacher, it's because they keep breaking in and stealing things. They're stealing from each other. They can't wait until they die off. One of these guys has a nickname, the Undertaker, because he's the first one that shows up at some widow's home to buy this shit up before the rest of the community finds out. They're waiting for some addict to fall off the wagon so that they can buy what they want. But they're mad at me for writing about it.
Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. This week it's the second part of our fascinating book club interview with Kirk Wallace Johnson, the author of the best-selling The Feather Thief, about the heist of bird feathers from the British Natural History Museum by an obsessive American fly tyer. Johnson comes across the story whilst fly fishing in Texas and looking for a new direction in his life after suffering from PTSD due to time spent in Iraq with USAID. He details how he followed the story bit by bit, uncovering the sometimes nefarious online world of classic fly tyers, which ultimately led to him confronting Edwin Rist, the man behind the heist. Continuing our conversation, Kirk explains why he chose not to reveal the name that Rist now goes by.
He's performing under a different name, and I did not, I always feel like the need to say this, but like I had to kind of balance some ethical responsibilities. Ethics isn't the right word, but like I wasn't writing this book to try to like ruin Edwin's life. And so part of me is like, hey, the justice system has said its piece. I don't agree with it. But being aware of the kind of vigilante tendencies of social media, when I was writing the book, I did not want there to be this stampede to try to like ruin him over this, which is why I didn't say what his the name he's performing with is. But on the flip side, I don't think you get to do something that bad, that wrong, and then also have a right to anonymity, or that no one has a right to understand what happened, or what happened to the rest of those birds either. And so that was part of the, I think, balancing act.
Were you surprised at the success of The Feather Thief, Kirk? Yeah,
I have been. I mean, I think it actually this week turns 5 years old, and it's still selling as much every week as it did when it first came out. And I think it's in Italian and Russian are coming out this year. I think it's in maybe 20 languages or something. And I'm now working on the adaptation of it into a limited series for Universal. So
that's cool.
I think there's an element to this story that I think the readers have picked up on in the same way that I connected with the story, and that there's some degree of escapism in this story. It takes you into this kind of crazy subculture that no one's ever heard of before. It takes you through a sweep of a couple hundred years of history. And there also is this like whole craze in true crime right now. And this happens to be a true crime kind of thriller that doesn't involve really brutal, gory crime. And so I think there's a lot of people that have embraced it for that too. But it's, at the same time, it's not like an empty calories book. You know what I mean? It's still wrestling with something hopefully more profound than just what happened that night at the museum.
Can I ask you one thing?
Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, just to ask you one thing because I don't want to give too much away. Asperger's, yes or no? Or can you say, or should
No, look, I think I always feel that like that was one of the hardest chapters to write in the book, because I did not want somebody to think that I was being insensitive to that possibility or to that community, but I've gone pretty deep into it, and people with we say Asperger's here, but Asperger's, like you don't lose your moral compass if you have it. if anything, they have a heightened sense and a heightened awareness of right and wrong. So in the interview, I think it was maybe like 4 or 5 hours into the interview, we finally broached that point. And I said to him something to the effect of like, I don't want to seem like a jerk or insensitive, but like, you don't seem like you have Asperger's to me. Like he was of all of the interviews, he was the most formidable opponent in this book. He would see lines of attack 6 questions in advance and very artfully like step around them. If I asked him something and he offered an answer, if I didn't have a perfect poker face, if my brow furrowed or if I smirked, he would change he would alter, he would read that and adjust it. There's of course, like there are stereotypical presentations of it, of Asperger's or now autism spectrum disorder. But I raised some of those, and I said, you're like, I know it's not limited to just this, but you're making eye contact, you're reading the subtext of my questions. Another thing is that you had meaningful relationships, long-term romantic relationships, which is another thing, another marker of people who have maybe more difficulty with it. And he said, like, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect of like, I became what I needed to become. And he said, so what are the markers? And he's like, it's repetitive motion, it's avoiding eye contact. And before my eyes and my wife's eyes, he started going like this, kind of mimicking how he was behaving in the interview with Simon Baron-Cohen. And so, and who Baron Cohen, who's also, I don't think a big fan of mine, but he did finally acknowledge that, yes, it could be faked. And so, this is something that it's something that I try to be very sensitive but honest about. That, like, in one of the interviews I had with an expert on this who was actually involved in Edwin's case, she said, well, yes, but there's also a part of the evaluation where the parents are brought in. And the parents are asked questions. This is Baron Cohen's assessment. And so I found the assessment. I turned to the parents tab, and it's like, did your child have difficulty making friends when they were young? 0 to 4. Did they do things in a repetitive way? 0 to 4. And I asked my wife, like, there's always this kind of, whenever I tell this story, people get awkward, but I'm just being honest. And I think if people are honest with themselves, they would land in the same place. I asked my wife when our son was born, if our son did something this stupid, where he's facing possibly a decade in prison, and we had an ability to put a finger on the scale to say, we'll help, but hopefully you'll learn your lesson another way. But like, would we lie a little bit? Would we say, oh yeah, no, he never had any friends? And the truth is, there was zero hesitation. Of course we would. I don't know if that's what happened in this case. I don't even know if this woman was just surmising, but I think I don't even know who answered that assessment or whatever. But the point being that there is he basically skated from any punishment because of this loophole. And it's tricky as an American to speak about this too, because it's not, I think he should have probably done some time, but we throw everyone in prison forever. You know what I mean? So our calibration of what is appropriate sentencing is completely, I fully acknowledge, is not the correct one. But it felt wrong here that because will be strange to your audience that hasn't read the book, but that because a grave robber in Bristol who had autism stole some bones a decade earlier, that Edwin was able to basically avoid any prison time. It seems odd. People are 6 months after the sentencing, someone from the Dead Zoo gang, another Ireland connection, from Rathkeale.
The Rathkeale Rovers.
Right. So one of the rovers sent somebody in to the Natural History Museum in Tring to steal rhino horn, because they were behind a rash of thefts over the late, aughts and early 2010s. And that guy sawed off a rhino horn. It turns out he stole a bunch of plaster because the museum knew about the dead zoo gang and they had already swapped out the real rhino horn for plaster. And he went to prison for 2 years for stealing plaster. So, I just look at it like there's someone who stole from the same museum and stole something that is absolutely, without debate, worthless, who had a far harsher sentence. I just don't think he had as effective lawyers.
Or didn't swing back and forth in the interview.
Mm-hmm.
And avoid eye contact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How did you manage to get the book published? Because you said how the publisher said, thanks, no thanks. Did you lean on the Attenborough connection? Because I would. That's what I do.
Yeah. Well, so what happened was at the after my first publisher passed on it, I was then sort of liberated from the first look deal. They had their first look and passed on it. And then I still have it. I'll be with her for as long as I write, but my literary agent then was free to take the proposal out. And the other publishers, we sent it out on I think a Friday morning, and by Monday I was in New York, and it was just there. People were putting bids in on the book without even meeting me. I think they saw the kind of strangeness of the story, but also that I had really turfed it out at that point. I mean, I think the book I got the book deal in 2015, and I heard about it from Spencer in the fall of 2010 or 11. I'm trying to remember now. So I was already, I wasn't doing full time, but I was already well into, I still now have the only printouts of all of these forum posts and things that don't exist anymore. And so
how much of the research would you say you would have had done by the time you pitched it?
I think I would say I was probably, I don't know, maybe 60% of the way there. But it's funny because I was going to all of the in the proposal, I had it broken down by chapter by chapter, and there was one, chapter 18 or whatever, but all it said is in which I sit down face to face with Edwin Rist. And all the publishers were like, well, what's he like? When are you doing the conversation? When are you doing that interview? And I was totally bluffing. He had been saying no to me for 3 or 4 years at that point. But I kept saying, oh, we're talking, we're just kind of negotiating it or whatever. And then, just to my luck, about a month later, he agreed to it. So, but it's in some ways there's some people I've noticed online that they complain that the book doesn't have this really overwhelming, satisfying ending.
That's the beauty of it,
where I kick in the door and find it all or whatever. And Lord knows I tried to figure out where all of them went, but it's more honest this way. It's the truth that these things this is going to be a long felt blow to that museum and to the scientific record and all of this. And so, and I'm certain that either they've all been chopped to bits, or there are people that might even hear this that know exactly which drawer in which chest on their fly tying desk there's a tring bird in there, and it's their own little. It's become even more valuable to them. I don't know. I'm speculating, but it was a very difficult thing to try to figure out. How does this end? How do I stop writing? Because it just kept going and going. I was going to say, we could talk about the new book, but your audience is they want feather thief, I'm guessing. So
yeah, but I do want to ask you about the net. It has fisherman in the title.
It does, yeah.
So please do tell us about the new book, Fisherman and the Dragon, which had fantastic reviews and has been hugely well received. So just give us a bit of background to that.
Well, the real quick version of it, it's in some ways kind of a connecting to this prior life of mine, but it involves a clash between Vietnamese refugees and the Ku Klux Klan. This is a true story, along the Texas Gulf Coast in the late 70s and the early 80s. And so after the fall of Saigon, we resettled hundreds of thousands of refugees. A lot of the Vietnamese had been fishermen back home. And so in trying to rebuild their lives, they started buying trawlers and crab boats and things. And it was a particularly rough moment in the economy. So there were a lot of white fishermen that were happy to unload these crappy boats on them. But then the Vietnamese just became so good at it, finding little efficiencies, fishing in weather that white fishermen wouldn't normally go out in, using family members as deckhands and all of this, that they became kind of an economic threat. And the white fishermen freaked out. And they ran to the governor of Texas and begged for a refugee ban. And when that failed, they brought the Klan in. And the Klan started firebombing Vietnamese boats and homes in a very kind of ghastly public campaign where the Vietnamese were given 90 days to get out or else face blood, blood, blood. And so this is a turf war over fishing grounds, even though the Vietnamese had every right to be there. But the Vietnamese kind of astonishingly, even though they had plenty of experience fighting, chose to put their faith in the U.S. Constitution, and they actually stood their ground and sued the Klan in what has become a pretty historic case. But they sued to assert their rights as fishermen, but also it broke apart the Klan's militia in Texas. And so that was another, there's a whole other angle to it, which is that this was a turf war, but this has now become the most polluted water in America because of the petrochemical industry. Mm-hmm. And so there were all of these toxic dumps into the bays and oil spills and things that were killing off the catch. But the white fishermen who worked at these plants in the off season looked at all of that and they said, no, the real problem is this tiny number of refugees that's coming. And so, they kind of debased themselves in this racist campaign to drive the Vietnamese out of there. And they failed, and the coastline is still no particularly safe place to be. I think the cancer rates there are something like 170 times the rate of the rest of the country. I was able to tell who worked at what plant by the type of cancer that they had. And so, but what's funny is like I had a number of confessions on the record from Klansmen that set fire to boats and burnt homes. And my wife was like, well, okay, it's either going to be a fly tire that gets us or a Klansman. But no, so it was so anyways, that book is out. That one is also supposed to be turned into a TV series as well. So that's kind of underway. But the truth is that it was such a tough story that near the end, when I was going through like all the final proofs on the book, I remember kind of complaining to my wife about like just how tired I was of just reading this racist garbage and all these interviews with these guys. And I was like, I missed a Feather Thief. Like I want to do the next project. I want to do something like Feather Thief again. And then lo and behold, it is the Feather, like I'm doing the adaptation of it. So, so yeah. So I don't know if it's just a short summary of it.
Yeah, no, it sounds fascinating. And was the research? How did you find the research to that compared to the Feather Thief in the sense of this was an old dead story Was it like?
Yeah,
I know there's still modern links, but it was for
yeah. I mean, the thing that, it's funny, like comparing the two, the Feather Thief, Fisherman and the Dragon, I would have all these revelations and people would confess to things that they shouldn't have been talking to me about. But the revelations were always horrifying and depressing. The Feather Thief revelations, like there is something horrifying about the heist, but it's more in the shock vein than horror. You know what I mean? That it's just, there's so many times where I'm like, okay, there's a, like I can't remember if this made it into the book, but there's one guy in this community that has struggled with like drug abuse his whole life, and he happens to be sitting on a very nice collection of skins and feathers and other materials. And a lot of guys told me that they wait for him to fall off the wagon. Like they get excited because he starts selling this stuff off to feed his habit. And so there are these things where you're like, I would come up one day, I'd be like, well, okay, there's a end times cult dude in South Africa who has private poachers to kill birds of paradise in New Guinea, and he admitted he's got the birds, but he won't give them back. Or there's a guy who, that drug addict, I've heard from several people that, and I didn't write it in the book because I was just like, I'm not trying to make everyone's lives miserable, but that I had heard that he had chopped up exotic feathers to snort with his coke.
Well, that's taking it to extremes, isn't it?
But if you read, the forum is gone now, but it was, I think I made this point in the book, they use the language of addiction. It's like a drug to them. They say that. They use the same kind of, like, what it does to your neural pathways and all of this, the thrill of finally holding an authentic, red ruff fruit crow feather or whatever, how it feels like, and so the fact that there's a direct confluence with drugs is like not surprising to me.
You talk about the stories, and it just reminded me there, the one that I found really sad was, you mentioned of a guy who had to go in for a brain operation and had a pet blue chatterer, and two guys turned up and persuaded his girlfriend to sell the pet blue chatterer, and they kill it.
Yeah, and you know what? One of those guys who I do not name in the book, one of those guys is the guy that gave the death threat to Spencer.
No.
Specimen.
But they're all saints, and Edwin was the only bad apple here, and there's nothing to look at, and everyone just move on, and this hobby's fine, and it was just a one-off or whatever, There's some point where it's like, there's so many points in this investigation where it's like the responses I got from these guys essentially amounted to, that old line, like, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And at some point where there's a denial of just basic reality here, that like this is a corrupting pursuit. And I if I sound like some moralistic preacher, it's because they keep breaking in and stealing things. They're stealing from each other. They can't wait until they die off. One of these guys has a nickname, the Undertaker, because he's the first one that shows up at some widow's home to buy this shit up before the rest of the community finds out. They're waiting for some addict to fall off the wagon so that they can buy what they want. But they're mad at me for writing about it, So,
Kirk, would you not do a sequel?
I know. I'm
telling you.
I'm telling you, yeah.
I think the series, if it all goes according to plan, is sort of where I'm channeling all this. So you will absolutely see someone snorting a feather at the end of the pilot.
That would make Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul even.
Yeah.
That would put that in the halfpenny place. Like, I'm just picturing some dudes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a like there's a part of me where I'm like, I can admire, like, look, I mean, I have a fly tying, vise right in front of me. I'm horrible at it, but I can tie like an elk hair caddis and like catch things on it. But if I'm using it for functionality. I tied a salmon fly under Spencer's guidance. It took, 8 hours and it was a, complete shit show. But so I can admire the artistry of it, but there is some part of my brain that I will never care if it's 4 wraps or 5, because I view these
Kirk.
I view these as like as a play a function. There's something, I have a more utilitarian approach to it all. It's not the romance behind it. But then I keep coming back to this. At some point, this just becomes like an existential, in the most literal sense of it. Like, what is real, anyways? Because they call a pheasant feather or a chicken saddle feather, they call that fake, and but it's real. But it's not the real thing, because Kelson didn't mention this, or Blacker didn't mention that, or Francis, so it's like, so there's a part of me where I'm like, oh, there's something cool about like connecting to, they're connecting to a time in fairly recent human history that basically like predated the Industrial Revolution, that predated the human impact on our climate. Back when everything was in abundance, when there was still even like some skepticism about extinction and whether things would ever run out, and so that romance resonates with me. I understand that, but I think when you then marry that to a marketplace of bragging rights, where these guys could be quite rough on each other over whether someone ties well or not, or whether this fly is done properly. When you start braiding status through all of that, and status envy, it's like it starts to become a little toxic, and it's a little tough for me, because I get sent these. I deleted my Facebook account, but I get sent screenshots from the private groups, and I see these 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds that are, being brought up in the same cult that Edwin was brought up in. That, well, all right, yeah, well, you're quite good at tying with subs, but that's not the real thing. And if you want the real thing, if you ever want to tie Traherne, you're gonna need $20,000 or whatever, and I think there's something where, I'm like, guys, just take a step back and maybe reassess here. I try to get Orvis, because I've become friends with Tom Rosenbauer, but I was like, you guys should sponsor a big classic fly tying tournament where it's some obscenely valuable prize for the one who ties the best with subs. And you can have a whole, like, all the greatest salmon fly tyers in the world, and see if you can dupe them, But to Tom's point, which is correct. I mean, they're already putting their money where their mouth is on all kinds of like environmental things. It's not Orvis's problem to solve, or whatever. It should come from within the community. But the fact that the guys who have tried to like at least push a little sustainability into this, or let's embrace substitutes, like they're all getting kind of flamed out of it, seems kind of damning.
I can't help but think, Kirk, if they stood in a river, cast into a rising fish, it might solve a lot of problems.
I agree. And that's funny, because there's like there's this huge split in terms of, I go into fly shops all over the US when I'm fishing, and like every one of those guys has read this book and they love it. They're not, anyone who's picked up a fly rod and reel can see this for what it is. to your point, that like, and so it's the ones that are quite far from the water's edge, I think, that are the most threatened by it. That I know anglers that do tie classics, and they do like to use the feathers that are, the exotic feathers, but they'll willingly tell me, like, I know it's nonsense, and I would never fish these things. It's just kind of a it's a hobby or whatever.
Forgotten entirely about this, but listen, Kirk, every guest we've on the show, we ask them a final question, and you've been forewarned, so hopefully you know about it, or thought about it. What has been your most memorable fish on the fly?
I have been thinking about it. I'm gonna tell you it with a bit of an asterisk, because it doesn't involve a fly, but it's fishing. But I was after the book came out, I was of all places, I was in Thailand. I went birding with Jonathan Franzen, the novelist, who he's a very well-known birder, but he liked the book and he invited me to join him. So I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks going through these forests, and I was not a birder before. I'd become a little bit of one now. But there was one day, I don't know, 10 days in it, that we were in this national park, like deep in it. And there was this fruit tree next to a pond. And there were these tropical birds. I forgot what they were, bulbuls, I think. And Franzen and some of my other friends that were there, they were like at hour 2, just parked staring at this tree. And as much as I like birds, I started to get bored. And I noticed, though, that every time the birds shook a little fruit loose and it landed in the pond, there would be this thrashing in the water. And there were these great big Thai carp. I don't know the name of the fish. But this hunter part of my brain got activated, and I was like, I want to see if I can catch one of these things. I didn't obviously have any equipment. So actually I have it here. Hang on. So I went into the forest and I found a vine, a little vine wrapped around a tree trunk. This is probably 10 feet long. And I gently unwound it from the trunk. And then I had a can of Coke, and I bent the tab off, and then separated it so that there's a little bit of like a hook there. I don't know if you can see it, but
yeah.
And then I went and picked up one of the berries and just kind of speared it on the tab. And it took 3 casts, and I pulled like about a 21-inch carp out. And I was like, I'll never forget this. This is like a very, and then I had to quickly wrap this up and jam it in my pocket because somebody tipped off the like Park Service cops or whatever, because they started driving down. And so I put the fish back, but it was this sort of like, to me, like the happiest moments I've had fishing are the ones when you don't have what you need and you have to kind of make do with what you have and make an adjustment. And when it works, it's just like it's like, deciphering some Enigma code or something, you know what I mean? So like, I have this makeshift, line hanging on my wall because every time I see it, it brings me joy. So anyways, it's not a fly, but I hope that works for.
No, but you know what it is? It's true fishing.
And truly memorable.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, does Jonathan Franzen and the other bird watchers think you were completely nuts?
It's funny because he's like, we've become very close friends, and he's he's interested. I just sent him a note the other day because one of my friends in Los Angeles is the director of the Moore Lab of Zoology, which has the largest bird collection, skin collection in Los Angeles. and they're getting rid of their 100-year-old specimen cases because they've just upgraded their lab. And so I'm like, my wife doesn't want me to get one, but I want to get one or two or whatever. But I sent it to friends and saying, hey, do you want one of these? And he was just like, he likes real bird, like live birds. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think he recognizes that there's an overlap in our sort of obsessive tendencies, but that for him, it's about going out and seeing these things in the wild as they currently are. But that book sort of forged a friendship between us, which I'm really grateful for.
Well, I have to say, Kirk, I'm so grateful for your time this evening.
It's my pleasure.
It's been an absolute brilliant chatting to you. It's been so interesting, from Fallujah, Iraq, the Feather Thief, the Fisherman and the Dragon.
True fishing.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody I meet that I know is into fly fishing, I say to them, have you read The Feather Thief? I was salmon fishing this morning. There was 5-6 other people there. I told them I was going to interview, and they're like, who's that? So I gave them the kind of synopsis of The Feather Thief. I said, you have to go out and buy it. Tom, I said it to you. I said, you have to read it. You have to. Anybody I've met, I said, you have to read it. I actually think your style reminds me of Patrick Radden O'Keefe.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm happy to be in that company. He's an incredible author.
So like, it just delving deep, going into that storytelling, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's The Natural History Heist of the Century, I think, is a brilliant subtitle for it, The Feather Thief. And your new book is The Fisherman and the Dragon, which I'm looking forward to reading too. Kirk, all I can say is thank you so much for your time. It's just been absolutely brilliant, and I am going to go back and read your book once more again after all this.
Well, thank you for having me, and if I ever get over there, I'll reach out to you guys. I'm hoping to be. Attenborough in the letter just told me, he's like, come by and come say hi when you're in London next, and of course it made me want to get on a plane right away to go hang out with them again. But there's one other thing that it may not be relevant, but just we're talking about the kind of meaningful things that have happened since the book has come out. But when I was in England, I had an extra day built into the tour because I went down to the southern coast and I spent the day with Alfred Russel Wallace's grandson, who was 93 years old at the time. And for those who haven't read the book, but this guy is a titan. He's the one that gathered up a lot of these birds. He's sort of famous for being not famous, but he independently figured out evolution through natural selection at the same time as Darwin, but we all credit Darwin with it now. And it was his birds that were stolen. And that's part of the reason why I think this became a book and not maybe just a magazine piece. But I went down there, and after a couple hours, I asked him if he had anything of his grandpa's that in his home there. And he brings me down this hallway to this kind of otherwise empty room, and there's a dresser in it. And this will only make sense for those in the book, but when I pulled open the drawer, there was a sheaf of correspondence like Darwin and other letters and things. But then he's like, look underneath that, and beneath it was the pocket watch and the sextant that he saved from the burning boat, which is what the book opens on. And then next to that was the field glasses that he used to sight the birds of paradise for the first time. And so I went out into the backyard and was peering through them, and it was just kind of like a magical moment. And so I think, in some ways it hits that same vein of like, part of this book is about wrestling with who we are as humans and our relationship with the natural world and with an earth that is changing quickly. And I think some people kind of try to grip onto something in the past that seems more constant or whatever. And so in some ways, for me, like, there was this magic too of like connecting with that moment through this object from back then. So I get it. It's just the difference is I did not steal it from Wallace's grandson. So, anyways, I don't know if that resonates at all, but
Our thanks to Kirk Wallace Johnson for joining us on the show. And you can buy The Feather Thief online. Get your hands on a copy. I can only really highly recommend it. It's a great read, really good read. And then don't forget to rate, review, and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.